Good morning. My name is Cece Zach, and I am working for Gateway Proven Strategies, and we are very excited to host this morning a webinar on opportunities in hemp specific to Mexico. We feel very strongly at GPS that with the changing legislation that is happening in Mexico and the wide variety of world events, that the time couldn't be better than today for us to learn about the abilities to commercialize and bring the realities of hemp alive in the marketplace. So I want to welcome all of you and thank you for attending. This morning, we will spend quite a bit of time with our panelists to discuss quite a few opportunities specific to hemp. And in the meantime, one of the things that I'd like to present to you all is some tips about how we might be able to communicate during this 2.5-hour webinar. You'll be hearing from our speakers throughout, and there will be time in the agenda for questions and answers. But please feel free to add your Q&A into the chat room so that I can monitor it and provide it to the right speaker during that time. So just a little bit about us. Gateway Proven Strategies is a cannabis consulting firm based in Denver, Colorado that has been the hard work of our two founders, Bob Hoban and Charles Feldman, who has built a global cannabis network to focus on the different issues and opportunities throughout the supply chain. We focus on an ecosystem of clients that ranges from the innovators or plant-touching entrepreneurs to the incumbents, which are primarily the Fortune 500, that are those that drive the consumer demand that is out there specific to hemp, as well as the governments that are writing and rewriting legislation specific to cannabis in their jurisdictions. And not least of all is the investors, those that are looking for the right investment with the right company at the right time. We also are very happy to partner with quite a variety of individuals as well as associations for this webinar. In specific, we are partnering with our sister organization, Hoban Law Group here in Denver, as well as CAM Legal as our legal representation in Mexico. We are also very happy to welcome Ryan Douglas Cultivation, as well as Akerna, and also partnering with Cannabis Salud, Latin America International Hemp Association, and also for 2020 within Mexico. With that being said, there is the opportunity for us to jump right in with Eric Singular, who is a member of the GPS team and is an extraordinarily global subject matter expert specific to hemp. After Eric, we will jump right in with Ryan Douglas, who is the CEO and founder of Ryan Douglas Cultivation. And when I introduce him, you'll find that his expertise in cultivation in various different topographies of the world will bring quite a bit of light specific to the Mexico climate. We have Rafael Sabag from Akerna that will talk about supplemental types of needs that anyone in the cannabis business will have, and we'll have a focus on compliance. And our last speaker of the day will be Bob Hoban, who will address the international commerce specific to cannabis as well as the economy associated with it. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that at the end we will have Luis Armendariz to help put in perspective what is happening in Mexico today in order for you all to understand the day-to-day of what's happening with the legislation. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Eric Singular, who will take us through the agricultural commodities specific to hemp in Mexico. Eric?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Cece, and I have to just say that it is such an honor to be here this morning. It's I think the excitement in Mexico and the excitement as a global community of cannabis enthusiasts and supporters and industry operators is all very excited to see Mexico come online. And let me just make sure that I have control of the screen now. Give me 1 second. And I'm sorry, Cece, I'm not able to control the slides currently. Is there anything that I need to do in order to do that? Cece, you're on mute.
Eric, thank you. I had an issue as well. And behind the scenes is our wonderful GPS team. Deanna, are you able to give Eric remote option?
Okay, there we go. Thank you guys. Sorry about that. So for the thrust of my conversation today, I really want to talk about hemp as an agricultural commodity. But before I do that, I do think it's important to just give a note on language. We have a lot of different terms for cannabis, and these are legal distinctions that are very important really throughout the world. And I know generally we divide the two sides of the cannabis plant into psychoactive and non-psychoactive. In the U.S., we use the terms marijuana and industrial hemp. And while the thrust of today's conversation is going to be on industrial hemp, it is absolutely worth noting that there is an enormous amount of possibility and opportunity for marijuana or high psychoactive, high THC cannabis in Mexico as well. And a LA Times article that was published this month stated that it is poised to be the largest legal market in the world for marijuana, pending the legislation that I know is currently in review and moving forward right now. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in today's presentation, especially with Luis Armendaris. So moving on, in 2018, the Congressional Research Service here in the United States conducted a study to see just how many uses there were for the industrial hemp plant. And what they determined was that there was about 25,000. That number ranges, and that number is not really set in stone because every day we are discovering new uses for the industrial hemp plant in our modern industrial world. But primarily, we can break down all of those uses into a couple different verticals, different types or production styles of hemp farming. You have a couple components of the hemp plant being the seeds, the fiber or stalks, and the flowers and leaves. And different production styles, as Ryan will talk about really when he dives into cultivation, will explore how different certain methods are depending on what your end purpose is. And we'll explore that a little bit more now as well. Really, when we're talking about growing for flower, we're talking about growing for cannabinoids. And of course, here in the United States and abroad, we've seen an enormous demand over the last couple of years for CBD. It has really been the market driver for hemp here in the United States. And while more minor cannabinoids and other chemical components, phytonutrients of the plant are starting to come a little bit more into the forefront, CBD has really been the thing over the past 5 years, been the component of the hemp plant that has driven the industry forward. However, we are starting to see, at least here in the United States, based on existing global markets, a growing demand and growing production for the other uses of the hemp plant. That would include grain for food consumption, whether that be for humans or for livestock, which is something we'll talk about as an opportunity for Mexico. And then when we talk about the stalk of the hemp plant, we're really talking about two different types of fiber. You have the outer fibers, the long fibers of the hemp stalk, which is used for the textile or woven uses. And then you have the inner fibers, the hurd or shiv, which is really a woody core, which has the wide range of applications from papers to biocomposites for plastics to animal bedding. The list really goes on and on. And just as a way to give a sense of how different the different production styles are for these certain end uses of the hemp plant. I just want to show a few seconds of a couple of videos. This first video highlights the production of hemp for grain. And you can see that what we're looking at here is a plant density that is pretty high. It looks as though it was planted similar to a corn or wheat crop. This is really hemp farming on a traditional row crop, large acreage production style. This video was actually taken in Germany and was highlights how certified seed, which is another component really on the genetic side of the hemp plant, is cultivated. So I just want to share a few seconds from that video, and then moving on, see if I can get to the next slide here. My apology, I seem to be stuck on this slide. This next slide is one of my favorite videos just to showcase the production of fiber. This video was made and put together by Patagonia, one of the leading hemp clothing retailers out there. And this is footage taken from China, which is really the global leader for hemp textiles. And you can just see that this crop in the early parts of this video, it's extremely tall. It's probably between 14 and 16 feet tall. It was grown specifically for those long, skinny stalks, similar to bamboo. And the further process that's shown in the video is the decortication, the process of getting those fibers, whether that's the long fibers or the short fibers, removed from the actual plant so that it can be used for the myriad of purposes that we just looked at. And one of the things to note is that while decortication technology and hemp textiles has been such a huge mover in the global market, and really when you look at Europe and China, we're starting to see that the US is really coming online for these kinds of technologies, this new ability to decorticate the fibers from industrial hemp. And I think as we look more at the specific opportunities for Mexico, and given the textile industry that is so strong in Mexico, I think there are going to be certain synergies there that will be interesting to explore. And then if we can just move to the last video real quick, and I don't know if that's you controlling it now, Deanna, it might be. I apologize for the minor technical difficulties here. The last video is really going to look at cannabinoid production, because when you're growing for cannabinoids, it is an entirely different production style than when you are growing for grain or for fiber. You're talking about something that's much more on a horticultural style. You're talking about a much lower plant density. And really, when you look at farmers and you look at agronomy, you really would depend on your farmers who are experienced with growing specialty crops to focus more on cannabinoid production, whereas you really would depend on your traditional row crop farmers, the folks who are growing for corn, who are growing for wheat, growing for sorghum. Those are the folks who are going to be more well suited to handle large scale production for the more industrial uses of the crop, rather than growing for cannabinoid production. And if it's possible to just skip out of these video slides, I apologize for the inconvenience there. Thank you, Deanna. So as you can see, this does not look anything like those other two videos that we just saw in those other two fields. This is hand harvested. This is a lot of care and attention given to every single plant. You have to make sure that you don't have any male plants in the field, as that could seed out your crop, and you need an all-female crop really to get the highest yield and the best production when you're working with cannabinoids. And it really is just to showcase how different the different production styles are when you're talking about industrial hemp to get to those 25,000 uses. So we can skip to the next slide. Thank you, Deanna. One thing I do just want to touch on, because it's become a real problem here in the United States, and it's something that I think other countries can learn from the hemp industry in the United States, is what happens when you have an issue of oversupply. And as we can see in this kind of case study for Kentucky, a state in the southern United States, the price of CBD biomass, the price per pound, has fallen consistently for the last 18 months or more. And you had so many farmers early on in the days of legal hemp in the United States who saw other farmers making a lot of money growing for CBD. You had a ton of people jump into it. You had the entire industry almost develop around it. And as a result, we just saw the price fall. And so it really makes the case for diversification and looking at the other uses of the hemp crop and not hinging the entire industry in a country or anywhere on one single component of the hemp plant, because there really is so much more to offer. So as we look specifically at Mexico, we know that Mexico's agricultural economy is huge. There is a growing need for cheap alternative livestock feeds. There's so much production of agriculture in Mexico that I think it makes a lot of sense that we're going to see large scale production of industrial hemp for grain and fiber come online pretty easily. The other component I wanted to touch on today was manufacturing. Automobile manufacturing in Mexico is a huge sector. It contributes a very significant amount to Mexico's GDP. And you've had a lot of car brands who have put in manufacturing facilities in Mexico in the last couple of decades. And there's going to be a lot of synergies with the hemp industry in Mexico, I think, in the automobile sector, and then also with textiles, as we mentioned before. And just to skip forward to the next slide, we can see briefly what the report from USDA here in the United States, what their large-scale snapshot was for 2020 for Mexican agriculture. And it is important to note that this report came out in March. A lot of what was forecasted for the year was impacted by COVID, but there are some things that just remain true no matter what, which is primarily that so much of the livestock feed component in Mexico is driven by US imports. And we know that Mexico's export of livestock, particularly beef, to China is a growing sector. So I really see an interesting synergy there with hemp being used as a livestock feed to replace corn or to supplement corn, wheat, other traditional livestock feed ingredients. So just looking at the grain market leaders currently in Mexico, we saw that wheat really did not change much this year. There was about 605,000 hectares harvested in the previous year, and then in this year again. Corn still remains the largest crop in Mexico in terms of production and consumption, and I think that's an important place to look at, because as we've known and we've seen here in the United States, farmers who are generational corn farmers are some of the most well-suited to plant and cultivate and produce industrial hemp. They have much of the equipment that you would use to plant corn is used to plant industrial hemp, and most of the harvesting equipment that's needed for combining the grain from corn can be used easily on industrial hemp. So really, without a lot of investment, without a lot of capital needed to transition. Hemp is well positioned to be a new rotational crop in Mexico. And then rice, an interesting thing that will likely be noted in Ryan's presentation is that there is a little bit of a challenge planting hemp on a field that rice has been planted. And he maybe will touch a little bit more on that. But really look to your wheat and corn and sorghum farmers as the folks who are going to be the most well positioned for industrial hemp production in the next couple of years in Mexico. Just looking really quickly at where wheat is produced, this is kind of a critical point. One of the things that we know for certain is that many of the industrial hemp genetics that are out there were bred at higher northern latitudes. So one of the things we've seen here in the United States is that as you have folks at farther southern latitudes, like Texas, for example, produce industrial hemp, they have a very different agronomy and agronomic needs than folks who are in, let's say, Colorado, Canada, anybody who's in that northern tier of the United States, the northern parts of North America and Europe. But I do want to note that as somebody who spends a lot of the time talking to farmers in Texas, and particularly in this far southern part of Texas that's right off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, we are seeing good performance with these European cultivars. And we are seeing folks who are really in this phase of learning what we need to do to be successful in growing hemp at these farther southern latitudes as you get closer to the equator. And if you look at that Sonora sector of Mexico, and you look at the high production of wheat, and you just kind of draw an imaginary line over to Texas, you can see that what farmers are learning in Texas as it relates to the production of industrial hemp is going to be transferable to folks in that Sonoran area and really folks in the northern tier of Mexico. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that there's a lot that we can learn from each other. And as it relates to genetics and finding the right genetics that are going to work in your region, that really is the first concern when you're looking at agricultural production. And we can relate more information back based on what we're seeing in Texas than we can for countries that are a little bit further south, closer to the equator. As I mentioned before, there is a growing need for cheap livestock feed. This is a sector that seems to be still in a growth phase in Mexico. As I said before, a lot of emphasis is placed on importation of grain into Mexico from North America. And the ability for Mexico to produce its own grain, a new alternative grain feed from hemp for livestock, I think is going to be huge. And I will say, on a very anecdotal note, while animal feed is still waiting to be approved here in the United States, there are folks who are kind of in a research and development phase. And as far as we can tell, all of their experience and the data that they do have on using hemp as a feed for animals is very positive. And generally speaking, what they are seeing is that you have to feed animals less hemp grain than you would corn, and the animals are still gaining weight and finishing just as well, if not better. So really you're seeing, you are seeing that it is a cost-effective alternative, particularly in that way. So moving on to the manufacturing sector. As I mentioned before, the automotive sector is really a huge component of Mexico's economy. And you have everybody from General Motors, Honda, Toyota, Ford, all who are producing automobiles in Mexico. And so I really think this is a huge opportunity because, as we know, there are already car companies out there who are using hemp composites, hemp paneling for doors today. And so as that sector really continues to grow, and as these automobile manufacturers continue to look for alternatives to petroleum-based plastics or other components of vehicles, I think that, if you have the ability to manufacture components of the hemp plant into different composites, different bioplastic based goods, and you have all of that in Mexico, I think that you're going to marry these industries very well. And then, as I mentioned, textile manufacturing is another huge part of Mexico's economy. And we know that hemp textiles are already really a booming commodity. We know that China is the leader. We know that the US and companies like Patagonia and Levi's are importing a lot of hemp textiles. It's a growing sector, and there seems to be consumer demand pushing for these kinds of new materials, let's say more environmentally friendly materials like hemp textiles for clothing. So a little bit more on that in a moment. But coming back to the automobile manufacturing, one of the largest car manufacturers in the world, being BMW, as I just mentioned, is really on a mission to make their vehicles with more recyclable materials. They're already making door panels out of hemp-based biocomposite, as I just mentioned, and I think this is where we're going to see a lot of synergy between what's possible with the hemp fiber uses and the existing industries that are currently in Mexico. And as I was doing the research for this, I saw that just a year ago, BMW opened a billion dollar assembly plant in Mexico. So really, just in doing the research for this presentation today, I just started to see all of these alignments, all of these synergies, where the industrial hemp industry in Mexico is going to easily be able to find a way to work with the other existing industries that really are at the heart of Mexico's economy. Moving on to textile manufacturing, I want to come back to this point about Levi's. Levi's is, of course, a very prolific brand here in the United States. We know that there is a history with using cottonized hemp to make denim with that company, and now we are seeing this wonderful push on their part to really bring hemp back. And they've recently released new clothing lines with hemp. There are, of course, other large clothing manufacturers here in the United States and abroad that are really trying to use hemp more and more. And again, another little synergy here with what's already happening in Mexico is we know that in 2019, Levi's started a pilot program for automated manufacturing and really just trying to put a stake in the ground for denim production in Mexico. It's much cheaper to produce clothing when you don't have to send it overseas. And so really seeing the opportunity here where you could have all of this happening in a domestic market. You would have the farmers growing hemp, the decortication technology in place in Mexico, and then your manufacturing sector, you would be not needing to rely on importing any of these raw materials. You would be able to really accomplish all of this almost in a vertically integrated way, all happening in one central location, which of course keeps the price down when you don't have to ship things all over the planet. And then really you have the best good that would end up being available for export. And as Bob will touch on later, and as something that actually Cece and I spoke about last week, is that there are certain international markets for hemp products that require maybe, let's say, less standardization and are a little bit more easy to enter into an international marketplace. Cannabinoids, the more chemical components of the plant, extracts, those are a little more challenging. They still exist in a gray area. However, something like hemp textiles, where there's already a booming international marketplace for these products, is much easier to move as an international good for export. And then just as I wrap up and kind of as a segue into Ryan Douglas's presentation, coming back to that sentiment on genetics, as I said, I think Mexico is extremely well positioned to see success with industrial hemp, but it all starts with genetics and identifying which seeds, which inputs are going to work, and really looking to what's happening in Texas, the experience that farmers in that region are having with industrial hemp, and just looking for certified seed. OECD is the international seed certifying body. AOSCA is the seed certifying body here in North America. These are the most reliable genetics on the market. I can say that unequivocally. This is how you ensure that you end up with a crop that is compliant from a THC or psychoactive, non-psychoactive component. And really, I think, as we saw here in the United States, how the industry begins is with a strong focus and a strong need for identifying good genetics. So with that, I thank you for your time today, and I will pass it over to Ryan.
Actually, if I could just jump in, Eric, thank you so much. And for those that you have joined since we opened up this webinar, welcome. I want to reiterate that we would like you to use the Q&A throughout the presentations, as we will be doing a Q&A session at the end of Ryan Douglas's talk. And so I will take those questions from the Q&A. In addition, you saw a polling, a questionnaire that flashed up on your screen during this time. We will be doing that again during the Q&A, and we would ask that you do fill that out. It helps us truly understand the needs and desires of our participants in order to produce the quality that we're looking for within these webinars. So again, look for that during the Q&A. And without further ado, Ryan Douglas is truly at the top of his trade. He has started Ryan Douglas Cultivation and has worked in commercial horticultural for 20 years and specializes in legal cannabis startups. He spent 3 years cultivating Canada's largest licensed producer of medical cannabis, which is Canopy Growth, and he now lives year-round in Colombia, consulting for business in the medical cannabis industry. So without further ado, I know you'll find Ryan's presentation very intriguing, and so thank you for joining us, Ryan.
Thank you, Cece, for the introduction. Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I'll take the next 30 minutes or so to kind of provide a bird's eye view of the process of cultivating hemp. As Cece mentioned, I'm coming to you this morning from a small city in Colombia, located between Bogota and Medellin. So I spent the last 4 years living and consulting from here on cannabis projects, but I work internationally. So I'm especially interested and excited to speak about hemp opportunities in Mexico. So from my perspective, really, what is the Mexico opportunity with regards to hemp? Now, this is not a technical agricultural term, but Mexico, like a lot of other warm weather countries, in my opinion, will become the global cannabis suppliers, because you've got, first of all, the climate that's conducive to growing cannabis, either outdoors or in very basic greenhouses. And like South America and Africa, you've got relatively low cost of labor. So you've got the perfect situation for a large scale, high volume producer of low cost cannabis biomass. So Mexico also has the opportunity to learn from other countries that have been at it for a while, certainly the US and Canada, but more specifically Colombia, who has had a commercial cannabis cultivation program for the last 4 years or so. And the idea really is to learn from everyone else's mistakes so the process in Mexico will be much more efficient. So over the last few years, from my perspective, the concentration really in the US and Canada and Colombia has been focused on flower production for either THC or CBD production and seed production, but for planting. Whereas in Mexico, depending on how the regulations are going to play out, perhaps some concentration on THC production, certainly on CBD, but more so, just like Eric was speaking about, I think there's tremendous opportunity in fiber production and also seed production for grain. So we'll start right in with the cultivation process. So immediately when we compare, even though hemp and what we would call marijuana or high THC or high CBD cannabis, it's all from the same family. Visually, there are very distinct differences in how the plants look. So if we look at the photo on the right side, this is industrial hemp grown for fiber. And it really resembles more a bamboo plant than it would what we would consider like a marijuana or cannabis plant. And that's got very tall stalks and relatively small flowers and almost no leaf production. And so if we look at the plants on the left, these are really more for flower or seed production. So the difference here is, even though industrial fiber naturally is a little bit more stockier of a plant, plants grow to where the light is. So on the left-hand side, if you give crops a lot of space, they're going to grow laterally because it expends less energy. The light and the space is there, so the plant grows laterally, and they're typically shorter and stouter. Now, the idea with fiber production is we're not interested so much in the leaves, perhaps the flowers if it's like a kind of a double use crop, but we're really interested in the stem. So when we plant a crop at a high density, there's no option for the plant to grow laterally. It can only grow up. And that's actually what we want to encourage when we're growing hemp for fiber, is really just a lot of stock production. So high density, the plants grow straight up and they grow really tall, and it becomes much more efficient in terms of harvesting the plant for fiber. So in my experience, go ahead there a little bit. In my experience, cannabis or hemp is a seamless replacement for other crops. So perhaps one of the most efficient ways to begin growing is to use cannabis as a replacement for other field crops. So corn or wheat or tomatoes. You've already got the land that has been tilled and amended for a number of years. You've already got the irrigation system in place. And I mean, just like corn, cannabis is a warm, temperature-loving, sun-loving crop that requires relatively rich soil. So that's exactly what corn requires as well. So in my experience, it can provide for a seamless replacement for other crops. And what we've seen here in Colombia is that it also is a seamless replacement for greenhouse crops. So this is more for flower production. Greenhouses aren't appropriate for fiber production because the plants are so tall. But when we really want to control the environment and produce cannabis for flower, it works really well in greenhouses. So these two photos are from a greenhouse in Colombia. On the left, they were producing chrysanthemums, and on the right, now they've replaced it with cannabis. So this is really efficient because there's a lot of similarities between chrysanthemums and cannabis. And so you've got the same greenhouse structure. You've got a lot of the same processes in terms of propagation and vegetative growth and flowering. And you've got a staff, a cultivation team that already knows how to manage a commercial cultivation facility. So it's really, in this instance, you're really just pulling out one crop and plopping in cannabis. And it can act as a real smooth transition to a new crop. So that being said, location is everything. So we'll have a look at a couple of the ideal parameters for growing cannabis. The first, of course, is temperature. So cannabis prefers a temperature range of 20 to 30 degrees Celsius. So ideally, that would be roughly 65 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So of course, it can grow outside of that temperature range. Right, no plant is so sensitive that a few degrees outside of the optimal range, it's going to die, unless we're talking about freezing weather. So cannabis can grow outside of 20 to 30 degrees Celsius, but what we find is that if it is chronically outside of that range, the plant becomes more susceptible to disease and insect infestation. So lower than 20 degrees, you'll have problems with root rot or increased fungus. And higher than 30 degrees, you could actually encourage certain insect infestations that prefer hot and dry climates. So generally speaking, 20 to 30 is the ideal range. Sunlight, as I mentioned before, cannabis is a sun-loving crop, so typically the more the better, but really a minimum of 6 hours of direct sunlight is required to grow a healthy crop. Humidity is a key point to keep in mind when we're talking about growing cannabis, especially for flower production, because the mature flower of a cannabis plant is really dense. It's actually made up of thousands and thousands of small pistils, which is basically a cannabis flower. But what we consider the flower is actually an accumulation of thousands and thousands of miniature flowers. And so it's really dense. And what happens is during the last few weeks of production, just before harvest, the flowers at their heaviest and densest. And what happens is if there's high humidity or a lot of rain, those flowers can be attacked by mold, and this mold spreads really quickly. So outdoors, we really can't control the rain, and even indoors, depending on the greenhouse, it can be challenging to really decrease humidity. So we can save ourselves a lot of strife by locating the production facility in an area where the humidity really doesn't exceed 70% on a constant basis. And based on my experience in Mexico, actually, that's not a problem, being a relatively dry growing region. So of course, cannabis, like most crops, needs a lot of water to grow, especially during the initial phases of production. So in my experience, well water is preferable to pulling water from a river. So with a river, you've got a couple of issues. You've got a contamination risk of whatever is upriver from your farm. So if anything accidentally or purposely enters the water supply, then you are in a very short time applying this to your own crop. So you've got a contamination risk, but you also need to invest serious money in a filtration system. So you need to filter all the sediment that's coming out of the river, and you want to filter that so it doesn't clog your irrigation system in the field. And so you need to have a pretty extensive filtration system and regularly cleaning these filters. So kind of a higher capital expenditure and a higher operational expenditure in terms of maintaining that system. So wells are definitely preferable to rivers. And the final point on location, if we're growing for flower, we want to be conscious of neighboring farms that could potentially pollinate our crop. So with industrial fiber, that's not such a big problem because we're really growing it more for the fiber and the stalk than the flower. If we're growing a crop for seed production, we really don't care what cannabis genetics pollinate that plant, because we just are after the seed production. We don't really care the genetics behind it. But if we're growing for flower, it's extremely important, because once a cannabis plant becomes pollinated, it changes the entire physiology of the plant. So it no longer exerts energy into producing flower. It stops flower production, it halts cannabinoid production, and it focuses entirely on seed production. So a flower crop that gets seeded is going to be less efficient to grow. There's just going to be less flower there to harvest, and probably more expensive in the post-harvest process because we need to separate out the seeds. So if there's no outdoor cultivations within 20 kilometers, you're probably pretty safe. 10 kilometers is still good, but the more distance, the better between yourself and the next cannabis or hemp farm. So in terms of soil requirements, really cannabis or hemp doesn't need anything special, anything different than a lot of other agricultural crops. So wheat or corn or tomatoes. When we look for an ideal plot to plant cannabis, as I mentioned before, the best situation would be simply to replace an existing crop that's been grown for a number of years. So wheat or corn or tomatoes. As I said before, you're already amending the soil. You've got the irrigation system in place. It makes for a pretty seamless transition. But if you're considering growing in an area that has not supported any agricultural crops before, we want to pay attention to a couple of things, because it could be very costly to amend the soil if it's not ideal for growing. So one thing we want to look at is the soil structure. So in my previous career as a greenhouse vegetable grower, I made a number of trips to Mexico to look at tomato growing plantations. And so in my experience, it was relatively arid region, and so more or less more sandy than compact. And so the reason why that's important, Eric had alluded to this in his talk, is that what we're really looking for in the structure of soil is something that allows for good drainage, but can actually hold on to a little bit of moisture at the same time. So if we look at one extreme, in a really sandy area, you're going to be using a lot of water and probably spend a lot of money on fertilizer because sand doesn't retain very much water. So the plant needs water, we irrigate it, but it very quickly drains. And so we need to irrigate again. On the flip side of that, if we're in a very compact soil, the problem is the water doesn't drain at all. And so the roots of the plant are stripped of oxygen and it begins to die. And so a good example of something we want to avoid are plantations where they used to grow rice. Because as we've probably all seen, we've seen rice paddies that are flooded with the water. And the reason they do that, it's a method of weed control. So rice has this really special plumbing where it pulls oxygen from the air and it gives it to the roots, so the plant survives when all the other weeds drown because of the water. And so in those instances, farmers want the soil to be compact. They want it to be very high in clay content so the water doesn't drain out. But if we pull a rice crop and then plant a cannabis crop in that area, we're going to immediately have root disease problems for a lack of oxygen. So basically what we want to do is, if we're looking at an area that has not been previously cultivated before, we want to take a number of soil tests to verify the fertility. If the fertility is low, it's just a question of comparing those soil tests to really the ideal parameters for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all the elements, and then we amend it with fertilizer prior to planting. But in addition to the nutrient content, we also want to pay attention to the structure. So we want to make sure it's not too sandy, where it doesn't have excessive drainage, but it's also not too compact, where there's no drainage. So planting density per hectare. These two photos are an excellent example of the two extremes when it comes to planting density. So I mentioned in a previous slide before that we want a high planting density for industrial hemp for fiber, because we really want to encourage the growth of that stock, which is where all the fiber is at. But on the extreme end of that, if we look on the right, here's a cannabis crop that's grown for flower. And so the idea is, because mold infestation is such a big risk during the last few weeks of production, outdoors, because we can't control humidity or rain, at least we can provide enough space between the plants to encourage adequate airflow. So in this photo, you see these plants are really big, they're stout. There's a lot of space around them. So again, they're growing laterally. They're not exerting energy to grow up. Practically, these flowers are just barely touching each other, but they're not packed in there so tight where it eliminates airflow. But this is kind of an example. When we look at the numbers on planting density, fiber production is really high, seed production is kind of in the middle, and then flower production is really low. But this is exactly the reason why. We want to encourage flower production and encourage airflow to minimize the disease risk. Whereas with the fiber production, if we're not really growing it for the flower, if there is any kind of mold presence on the flower, it doesn't matter, because our concentration usually, most of the time, is going to be on the fiber. So how do we start? Starting from seed is pretty straightforward. If we look at that photograph on the right-hand side, this is going to be more typical for industrial hemp production. So we plant the seed in the ground, and the majority of the plants come up. So there's always going to be some fraction of the amount of the seed lot that does not germinate, and some portion is going to be eaten by birds or animals. And so what farmers typically do is they just let it be, or after a week and a half or so, they go back, they can see where the bare spots are, replant, and as long as they do it within a week or two of the initial planting, the size is usually equalized during the course of the crop. So direct seeding into the field is an option. A little bit more efficient, if you have access to kind of a protected environment or a greenhouse or a shade house, would be to start the seeds initially in some kind of a seeding tray, and then transplant outdoors, either by hand or by machine, or planting equipment that's attached to a tractor. So this way you eliminate dead spaces. You can select the very healthiest seedlings, and you kind of do it all in one step. So that's one option, starting out from seed. So that's appropriate for hemp production for fiber, and hemp production for grain production. Now, if we're growing for seed, clone or vegetative propagation is usually the go-to method. And so here's the reason why. When we're growing for flower, especially CBD production, typically we have to stay under a certain threshold of THC, because if we're beyond that threshold, then really the crop or the finished product is unsaleable. So seed genetics typically are relatively unstable when we talk about cannabis. So once we've identified the perfect variety that's high in CBD, low in THC, we want to be able to duplicate that thousands of times. And so one way of doing that is through cloning. And so if we look at the photograph on the left, these are what we call mother plants. Each one of these plants has the characteristics, the cannabinoid content that we want. And so what we do is take cuttings or clones, which are in this middle photo. It's basically a shoot from the plant, roughly 4 to 6 inches in height. We put that into a substrate, and after 2 or 3 weeks, it will grow roots. And now we have a genetically identical plant from the mother plant. And so these mother plants on the left-hand side could probably generate 250 cuttings every 2 weeks. And so if you look at the picture on the far right, this is what we end up with. We end up with hundreds or thousands of genetically identical plants that we can now transplant outdoors or in a greenhouse. So this is common, really the most common method of plant propagation in the US and Canada. But it does have two risks, which are important to pay attention to when you're designing your production facility. One is that if those mother plants get a disease or an insect infestation, it's very likely that every single clone we cut from them will manifest that disease, will show that disease later on in production. And so if the mother plants become infested, we can't continue propagating diseased materials. And so now we have to go back and replace those mother plants. And essentially, that could bring production to a halt. Everything could stop because we can't produce diseased plant material. And if we don't have anything else to pull from, that's a real issue. So that's one risk. The other risk is that rooting clones on a commercial scale is something of a talent. It's an acquired skill. And in my experience, not every cultivation team can pull it off. So when we schedule production like this, we anticipate maybe 80 or 90% of the clones that we take are going to root. But I've worked with clients that struggle to get 40 or 50%. So between the risk of propagating disease and the variability in your cultivation team's capacity to successfully root these plants, it can really throw a lot of unknowns into production planning. So that's why we may want to consider, if we're growing for flower, is propagation through tissue culture or micropropagation. So this is similar to cloning in that we're taking pieces of a plant and we're duplicating it. But the difference with micropropagation is that we really only need very small pieces of plant material to reproduce it. You know, every cell of that plant has the genetic potential to grow a new plant. And so instead of taking, if we look at these mother plants on the left-hand side, instead of taking 200 or 250 cuttings from one plant, we could get literally thousands and thousands of cuttings from one plant using micropropagation. And the other benefit is that during the process of this tissue culture propagation process, we eliminate any risk of disease. So there's a way of really cleansing the plant material and propagating only certified disease-free material. And of course, there's no insects. So it's a little bit more advanced, really probably only appropriate for flower production. And the only other consideration to keep in mind is that it takes a little bit longer, the process. So traditional cloning takes about 2 or 3 weeks from cutting the clone to getting roots, whereas tissue culture can take around 3 months. So that's only a problem if you don't know how to plan production. But if you have an empty greenhouse that's going to be ready on a certain date, or you have an empty field that's ready to be planted on a certain date, instead of taking cuttings a couple weeks ahead of time, we begin the tissue culture process 3 or 4 months ahead of time. So moving on, talk briefly about the concept of cannabis being photoperiodic. And so that essentially means that the cannabis plant begins to grow flowers when it experiences long nights of roughly 12 hours or more. And so this is unique in the plant world. Not many crops initiate flowering based on the length of daylight. Daylight or nighttime. So normally it's temperature or maturity, but chrysanthemums, poinsettias, and cannabis are photoperiodic. So this can be an issue in countries like Colombia, because we're so close to the equator. Every single day and every single night are roughly the same amount of time year round. So here in Colombia, the sun rises between 6:15 in the morning, and it sets around 6:15 in the evening. So the problem is, because we have these long nights year round, if you direct seed a crop outdoors, or you plant a rooted clone outdoors under these long nights, the plant begins to flower immediately as soon as it breaks through the ground, or as soon as the clone really takes hold of the soil. And so the problem is, we end up with very small plants, and it does not become efficient to cultivate cannabis in this method. So in regions close to the equator, excuse me, we need to look at alternatives for basically breaking up that long night. So if you look at the picture in the middle, here's a greenhouse that uses supplementary lighting. So they either extend the day as soon as the sun goes down at 6, they turn on these lights and they extend the day until 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night. Another option, instead of extending the day, is actually breaking up the night cycle. So we let the, we use the natural course of sunlight, 6 in the morning to 6 at night. And then around 10 o'clock at night, we turn on the lights for about 15 minutes and we break up that night cycle. And then around 2 o'clock in the morning, we do it again. 15 minutes of light, we break up the dark cycle. And then 4 hours later, the sun comes out. So we're purposely preventing the plant from going into flower until it reaches a size that's appropriate to initiate flowering. So fortunately in Mexico, the farther north you get, the more variability we have in a day length, but it's going to be something that you really want to put a lot of attention into if you're going to launch a commercial cannabis cultivation in Mexico, are the genetics, and with some specific attention around to time. So just before I move on here, there's something called auto-flowering strains, which can be an option because these plants don't flower according to night length. They flower according to maturity. So roughly 6 to 8 weeks after planting an auto-flowering seed, they begin to flower. But the problem is, as we can see in that picture on the right-hand side, is typically, again, they finish really small. So it's not very efficient to launch a commercial cultivation site using auto-flowering strains. So I've just got a few more minutes here. In terms of plant biology, very generally speaking, cannabis plants are usually either male or female. But when they're exposed to stress, they can actually grow both male and female flowers with the goal of seeding themselves. So if we think about a place like Mexico, let's say we've got an outdoor cannabis cultivation. If you've got really intense heat, really intense sun, a really dry atmosphere, and for some reason there's no water or the irrigation system isn't working, you create kind of a mini drought. And if that happens consistently during the crop, it's a very stressful event for the plant, and it's very likely going to grow, a female plant is going to grow male flowers to seed itself as a reaction to that stress. So in terms of pests and diseases, unfortunately, there's a lot out there, and we can anticipate there being more because we've got more and more countries legalizing cannabis, more and more large outdoor plantations. And so that's just how monoculture agriculture works. So really, two pieces of advice. One is to, in terms of insects, you really want to associate yourself with a beneficial insect supplier. So beneficial insects are predatory insects we release on the crop, and they hunt down plant damaging insects. But we really need to establish a population of beneficial insects before the bad ones arrive. So you want to find a company that distributes beneficial insects and someone that can really act as a technical advisor throughout the crop. The other piece of advice I would give is to associate yourself with a laboratory that can test for plant diseases. So usually agricultural universities have a lab, or they can recommend a lab to you. So if you look at this picture on the right, for example, this could be anything, right? So my first thought would be perhaps an irrigation tube is clogged and that plant isn't getting water. But in the event we see, yes, it does have water, now we have to start troubleshooting what does this plant have that the other ones don't. And one step in the troubleshooting process is to send a piece of that plant material to a lab and determine if it has some kind of a plant disease. So quickly here, the crop cycle on average, whether we're growing for flower, seed, or fiber, is roughly 4 months. Here are some yield numbers, and these are all over the place because you've got a lot of variables in terms of plant height, plant density, where you're growing, but some rough numbers we could use to gauge or at least create a pretty broad business plan. So in terms of harvesting, Eric had mentioned decortication is the process where we separate the fibers of the stalk. So the bast fiber is kind of the stringy fiber that's on the outside, and the hurd is more like the woody fiber that's on the inside. green microfiber is everything else, kind of the flowers and the leaf. So traditionally, some people have used a process called retting, R-E-T-T, retting, as a way to help separate the fiber from the hurd. But retting is actually the initial process of rotting. So what they would do is cut the hemp, let it lay in the field, and depending on the moisture and the temperature, it actually starts to decompose the plant, making it easier to separate the fibers. So the problem is it's very dependent on humidity and temperature. And after a period of time, you got to go to the field, flip the plants over, and then let it sit for a little bit longer. So as commercial growers, we really need to establish a protocol for harvesting regardless of the temperature. And we really want it to be kind of low labor intensive. So we can't go out there flipping hectares and hectares of fiber by hand and then harvesting it. So my recommendation is to harvest all the material at once and then invest in a decortication technology or equipment. And so as Eric mentioned, there's more and more coming to the market. There's companies in the US and Canada that are creating this equipment to make our lives easier. So really the ideal situation is to harvest that material raw, put it in one end of the machine, and then what this machine does is separate the hurd from the bast fiber, from the seeds, from the flower. And so that's really the ideal situation. In these photographs, you have some smaller mobile, more mobile equipment to do the decortication, but you're welcome to contact me and I can send you photographs or links to some equipment that's much larger, much more comprehensive, and does exactly that, separates everything out for you. And so wrapping up here, when we harvest for flower, basically there's two ways to do it. We can cut the plant, hang it to dry, and if we maintain the temperatures around 20 to 25 degrees Celsius and around 40 to 50 degrees relative humidity, percent relative humidity, that crop's going to dry in about a week to 10 days. The other option is to use basically ovens, where the product goes in one end and it moves throughout the equipment on a screen, and within about 2 hours the product is dry that way. When we harvest for seed, we really don't need to look for any technology or equipment that's different than any other grain separating equipment. So typically we harvest the material, it goes through different screening processes, and what comes out at the end is the grain. So cannabis isn't any different in that sense than other products that are grown for grain. What we do need to do is pay attention to how we store it if we're going to store it long term, because if it's if it's too wet, the seed could begin to go moldy, or it could actually begin to germinate. And if it's too warm, there's insects that will attack the grain and start to eat away at it. So we want to look at about a storage temperature of 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 4 to 10 degrees Celsius, and then a relative humidity of about 40% for storage. And as I wrap up here, just quickly some different capital expenses to consider prior to being licensed. This is going to be different depending on where you are, what you're growing, how you're growing. So it's going to be much different if you're growing outdoors, if you're building a greenhouse. But just some things to keep in mind, from employees to consultants to project managers, funds you may need to have in the bank prior to being licensed. After being licensed, that's really where the expenses pick up. So again, depending on whether you're growing in a greenhouse or outdoors, you might need to bring water or electrical service, certainly some construction, irrigation equipment, all of the growing materials, pest control products, etc. And then in terms of ongoing operational expenses, outdoors, electric, not so much, but certainly for a greenhouse, labor, non-reusable grow materials, and certainly water. So folks, to wrap up, I think that Mexico certainly has an opportunity not only to catch up to where Colombia is today after 4 years of having a legal cannabis program, but they could actually surpass it rapidly. I think that there's a tremendous opportunity for grain production and fiber production, but certainly flower production as well. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I will pass it over to Cece.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was both you, Eric and Ryan, and it's wonderful to see what the value proposition is that cannabis can bring to the industry through Eric's presentation. But then going to the micro level with Ryan's discussion about the opportunities in all food, fuel, and fiber, and the complexities associated with growing for each types of those businesses. Which is something that Bob Hoban will touch upon later, because it really is important to understand as you enter into this marketplace where in the supply chain you actually will fall in order to commercialize and ultimately follow the dollar of the work that you're looking to do. So with that, I'd like to spend the next moments and addressing some of the Q&A to both Eric and to Ryan. So Ryan, I think this one is more suited for you. Can you address or think about hydroponia? It was specifically from Isaac Nurko that had asked that question.
Sure. Yeah, so hydroponics is a method of growing plants without using soil. So this is more appropriate for greenhouse production because it would be impossible outdoors because we're growing in soil. So typically, instead of soil, what we do is provide plants with a substrate, a structure that gives the roots something to hold on to while it grows. And so with hydroponics, instead of the roots having to look in the soil for nutrients and water, we deliver the water and the nutrients right to the plant. So the energy that would otherwise go into the root production can go into the flower production. So it's a very efficient way of growing. Plants typically grow faster and they yield more in hydroponic systems than in traditional soil production. But again, it really only applies to greenhouse production.
Thank you, Ryan. Alberto Centino asks, have industrial hemp cultivars for tropical climates been developed or ready? Or should we look into breeding programs once it gets regulated? And I know that you addressed the breeding program a little bit, Ryan, but specifically to this question with Mexico and tropical climates, that would be great.
Yeah, so that's the $1 billion question. If you can breed industrial hemp plant that performs well in tropical regions, you could retire tomorrow, right? I mean, that's the push. That's every single country that has legalized cannabis for hemp production that's anywhere near the equator, above it or below it. That's the first thing they start looking for is hemp that behaves well in those environments. So the trick is, in the absence of those kind of genetics, in order to allow the plant to grow to an appropriate size to start flowering, or for industrial hemp, just to really hopefully never go into flower so it continues growing stalks, we have to interrupt the night or break up the night. And so when we think about large plantations, like hectares and hectares of plantations, it's just not feasible to mount a lighting infrastructure over a farm of that size. So you've got a number of companies that are breeding and working towards that effort. I know there's a handful here in Colombia that are doing it. But as of today, my knowledge, there's not one producer or one company or certain strain that's available across the world or in high volume that performs really well in tropical environments. Because we've got to remember that the majority of hemp production up until now has been in northern regions, places like northern China, the Soviet Union, Europe, and Canada, where they don't have the challenges that we have in the tropics. So that's a long answer to saying it doesn't exist yet, but as soon as it does, it's going to be a game changer for the global cannabis industry, in my opinion.
Thank you, Ryan. And I would also mention, or actually ask you a question, is this the type of work that you do with your clients to help them understand how to set up the appropriate farm per se, and exactly how you operate that farm specific to the climates?
Exactly. So since I specialize in startups, I help companies really avoid the typical mistakes so they can come to market more quickly. And so what we would typically do is avoid any kind of breeding activity because it's really a long-term play. So what I would help clients do is acquire genetics that are appropriate for their region in order to help them start up rapidly.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ryan. The next question is around acreage versus production capabilities for industrial hemp. And I know, Ryan, you briefly touched upon it. And the question goes on to how many acres needed to produce a good production of either plastic or fiber, and what kind of investment and equipment is needed to process. So if you could just help us, just reiterate the variability of acreage and production, as you mentioned in the presentation. But talk a little bit about the difference for growing for plastics versus fiber, and maybe the difference in the equipment that may be used for those specific to this question.
So I'm unfamiliar with the process of generating plastics from, but I assume it comes from the oil of the seed. And so regardless of the actual end product, the processing is going to be the same, because we need to go from that plant, that fresh plant, and we have to separate it down into the ingredients that we need, the raw ingredients, which in turn is going to produce either plastics or clothing or construction materials. So that, as a cultivation consultant, I'm really unfamiliar with the post-harvest process that far down the line. But the initial harvesting and processing process will be identical, because we need to separate the materials that we need. The other question was in terms of yield and cultivation area, I think.
Yeah, yes, acres needed for good production of those different, the plastics and the fiber.
So yeah, so that's a tricky question to answer, because when we think about it, if you're growing really short plants that flower early, or you can allow the plants to grow a long time, those plants could be 2 or 3 times the height of a really short plant, which in effect affects your yield. But growing 1 or 2 acres of fiber of hemp for any kind of production, it's really given the investment and the post-harvest processing, I mean, you really want to go really big. So 1 or 2 acres is a really small portion of area to work with. I think you'd want to look at 10 or 20 acres, or in hectares, maybe the same, 10 hectares. I think the outdoor growing is the least expensive method of growing cannabis, and the game here is really low production, high volume. And so I think when you look at 1 or 2 acres, I think there would be more costs than benefits involved. So I think we really need to think much larger, especially when we're talking about oil or fiber production.
Eric, do you have any comments?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that I actually think that these 2 questions that have been posed are very related. And the reason for that is because in order to make fiber make sense, what we're seeing in the United States, and this is something really to take away from today, Texas is really emerging as the first mover in North America for fiber processing, and we're talking $1 million investments in the technology, and the number ranges widely, and it all has to do with what Ryan's talking about as far as separation. Different types of separating the fibers in the stalks. It will take more infrastructure, less infrastructure, more technology, less technology, and that we've seen huge investment into that sector, particularly in Texas. But here's where it gets a little challenging. In order to invest millions of dollars in a decortication facility, you then need to have an enormous feedstock. You need to have thousands of acres being produced of fiber. And where we're starting to kind of see a challenge potentially emerging, and really it's an opportunity more than a challenge, is we don't know exactly how industrial hemp and the existing varieties and cultivars are going to perform in southern Texas. But you also have $1 million decortication facilities being built in Texas. So it's going to be very interesting over the next year or two to see how those 2 things align. I think there will be a lot to learn in Mexico from kind of watching that develop. And what I would say is, there's about between 100 and 200 certified hemp varieties according to the OECD seed schemes. Those are the registered true hemp varieties out in the world. And there are, a handful of plant breeders who have developed those genetics. And what we've seen in Texas is this push for plant breeding. The challenge with that is that you have to get the approval of the initial plant breeder, the person or group or organization who owns those genetics. They need to be involved, because that gets into plant variety protection and international or intellectual property for these different genetics. So my advice on both of these questions is to start small. Make sure that you have the right genetics, that you're able to produce a fiber crop, and then watch what Texas is doing. Kind of keep an eye on Texas, especially in this, as we move into 2021. They had a very poor production year this year because they planted very late. The planting date, the planting window is critical. So you have a very relatable climate and relatable geography in some ways to Mexico. I would say start small and pay close attention to how the industry develops in Texas, which is on the other side of the border. As far as the most innovative hemp products that I've seen, plastics are huge. I don't think we've even scratched the surface of what's possible with hemp plastics. And we're also seeing building materials, so hemp being used in construction to create a form of concrete. And then one other is hemp being used as a wood alternative. There's a company in the southern part of the United States who is developing any product that you would make using wood with hemp. And of course, there's a huge environmental benefit there, because it takes years to grow a tree. It takes a couple of months to grow a hemp plant and to harvest, if you have the right equipment. Really, something that can make the same end product. So there's a huge market for all of these things. It's just a matter of being patient and letting that innovation occur over time.
Great. Thank you very much, Eric and Ryan. It was a wonderful, wonderful overview. I'm hoping that all of you can see the poll results of the questionnaire that we took at the beginning of this webinar. And before I introduce our next speaker, I just think it would be interesting for all of you to recognize the interest with all of the participants that are on this webinar. And if I just look at the answers to the first question, is that most people are looking for general hemp industry, with those around manufacturing and processing coming in a close second. The critical factor that you all believe right now is really understanding the legal and regulatory frameworks. And I know that both Bob and Luis will address those in the balance of this presentation. Most of you are in agricultural. It's nice to see that there's a few in the legal professional services, as well as distribution and retail. And what you'd like to get out of this webinar today is really around hemp cultivation, hemp distribution and retail opportunities, as well as legislative issues. So I hope that we will, if we haven't addressed some of the questions that you have, that with our last three speakers of the day, that we will be addressing that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Rafael Sabag, who is a business development leader at Akerna and a cannabis technology expert. He's been in the industry for quite some time and has a wealth of knowledge around the supportive resources and services that you need in order to create a business out of what it is that you're doing. So with that, Rafael, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me well. It's a pleasure, Cece. Thanks for the intro. And it's always a great opportunity to learn whenever I have a chance to listen to Eric and Ryan. So very informative first part of the forum there. I'll keep my part a little more brief and just focus on a high level. I want to take some time to provide everybody just a high level understanding of the technology that's not only available to help your businesses as this market launches and expands, but also some technologies that you may end up being required to use. So Kurna MJ Freeway is a seed to sale tracking software. I'll explain a little bit more what that means. But the point is, we are one of the market leaders, if not the market leader, in the space for tracking and business management software for cannabis and hemp. We were the first to launch in the space, launch a software that focuses on managing these businesses. And since then, we've expanded a lot. So with that, one thing I will mention, make sure I have control of the screen here. But if not, Deanna, thank you. I'll let you know if I have trouble, Deanna, and you can just go to the next slide. But a little bit with my background. So I've been in the space for a while, and with that, I've helped many states, so regulatory bodies and private companies implement, design, and launch their tracking systems. And every state and country is going to be a little bit different. So as the regulations are developed, right now in Mexico, I'm sure there will be certain requirements as to what needs to be tracked and in what manner. Maybe it might be some areas, some markets have lighter regulations than others, but for the most part, what we see across the board is that in order to be a compliant business, you will need to implement a baseline technology that will help you track and manage your business. And these technologies will help take care of three main things nowadays. First is going to be compliant. And I'll mention in a couple of the other slides how that breaks down and how the software is going to help you stay compliant with your operations. The second one is going to be the ability to provide you guys with data-driven insights. So a lot of what Eric and Ryan were touching on was the ability to kind of suss out what would be a viable, what are viable genetics, and not just when you guys are actually cultivating, but taking into consideration the output from your crop. How much not just was harvested in terms of raw weight, but specifically into different outputs, right? So how much of that was fiber? How much of that was HUD or seeds? All right, so data-driven insights. And then the last piece that I'll mention will be business enablement tools that will kind of latch on to that. So with this slide, what we're seeing here is the regulatory framework that is kind of required for your tracking. All countries or states are going to require some form of tracking. The way in which they require it generally falls into kind of three main buckets. So what that really comes down to is if the regulatory body will require a government run tracking system that every business must report into or not. So if the government is providing that kind of a system, they're going to run a regulatory body. They're going to host and manage a central database that every business, every operator has to kind of report their daily activity into. And that's usually going to be accomplished by the business utilizing a business software like MJ Freeway that simply plugs into that state database in the back end and does it automatically. But that shakes out into a couple different ways. So a centralized system is one in which the state will provide not only that central database, but also a front end for the businesses to run. So you will have to use the system provided by the department or the state or the regulatory body. Another setup is one in which, more common than not, the regulatory body will provide only that central database that everybody must report into, whereas then each business can go and find the business software that best works for them, best suits their needs, as long as it integrates via an API or similar format to the state system. And lastly, what may actually be the more common scenario or more likely scenario in Mexico would be a more decentralized system in which each operator is responsible for managing their own business software platform, managing their own records and their own data, and making sure they're keeping everything that they need to keep, tracking everything they need to track, and then probably just either providing regular reporting to the department or furnishing those reports when an inspector shows up. So that's the high level on the regulatory side of what you can expect in terms of systems being required. Going into the next slide here. These next couple slides, what I'm going to show is just the very basic level of what these tracking systems actually track, what they actually provide, what the workflow is for you, right? So these tools that I mentioned, these tracking systems, at the end of the day, they're going to be your enterprise resource planning, so business software that's going to allow you to run your operation. So they're going to do a couple things. The most six things they're going to do. So the first most basic thing they're going to do is they're going to allow you to track the life cycle of your product so that you can properly represent how many hectares, or if you're doing an indoor grow, how many plants you're currently growing, where those plants are. And that's not just for your individual business tracking purposes, so that the cultivation manager can manage the efficiency of operation and so on. But it's also so that if an inspector from the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Health were to walk in and do a spot audit, they could say, hey, let me see these 3 plants. I want to make sure that you have what you say you have, et cetera. So the first couple items there are more basic in terms of supply chain tracking. So the life cycle tracking, so that you can manage each stage of the process. So as you have growing plants, you'll be able to have those registered in your system and tracked. As you harvest those plants and turn it into biomass or products, you'll have that activity tracked, as well as the resulting product in your system tracked. So everything's accounted for and managed. Quantity and location and chain of custody is really just managing accountability, so that not only can you represent what stage the product is in, but how much of it you have, where it is, who touched the last, and those kinds of things. Moving on to the next slide, if you don't mind, Deanna, please. Oops. So, and then now getting more into some of the still compliance related elements where you'll be managing your workflow within the platform, but this is where you start seeing where you get more data driven insights. So for example, you'll be managing your plans and keeping track of them within these softwares, but by virtue of managing your business and all the data you'll be entering on a week-by-week basis or a day-to-day basis just manage business, you're going to end up with robust data on the back end happening, pretty automatically by virtue of the platform. That's going to start letting you know, okay, out of your harvest over the last 4 months, or out of the crop over the last 4 months, these are some of the strains performing best, some of the conditions that help you perform best. These are the product outputs, and not just being able to measure those outputs in terms of the plant, but also in terms of the personnel, the employees, which growers were performing more efficiently, those kinds of things. But you'll also be able to have what you're seeing here, so origin traceability. So by virtue of these softwares running your operation, and also running the operations of your partners and customers and your vendors, you really get robust traceability and trackability that not just gives you the compliance you need to show where everything's been, but it also gives you more marketing abilities where you can start proving and showing, hey, this is a product that's specifically from this Mexico region. So it gives you a little bit of compliance and ensuring that the product is what it is and it is where it came from. But it also starts giving you the ability to start managing a little bit more of, I don't know, farm to table may not be the appropriate term to use here, but it gives you more of an ability to show some transparency, show to your buyers where the product's coming from, which provides a lot of good stuff there. It allows you then to also manage the workflow and data management. That's the insights I mentioned, but the managing your workflow, where that really comes into place is, and some of the folks that Ryan might be working with, more startups, folks who may be a little newer to this industry and maybe nervous as to making sure they don't kind of fall out of compliance and want to make sure they do everything by the books. These softwares will usually have configurations in place that allow you to make sure that you're following those rules. For example, if one of your staff or yourself is going to do something you're not supposed to, the software in question, whether it be under freeways or any software really in space, they will give you an alert saying, hey, based off of the regulations in Mexico and the fact that you're X or Y license type with your processor or cultivator, you're not allowed to do this action anymore. Stuff like that. So it'll definitely help there. So the software's in the space, and I'm kind of going through this at a very high level. I encourage you guys to reach out. I'd love to talk in detail as to how you can implement these, not just to make sure you stay compliant, but also to make sure you guys have great profit margins and good operations. The meat and potatoes, the core of the software needs and software use is going to be compliance related, product management related, allowing you to keep up with your operations, not just with compliance, but with data insights. However, a very big component to the tech space that you're going to need is going to be more what I refer to as business enablement tools, right? So whether they be tools for marketing, for e-commerce, for maybe more specific needs as to managing the certain elements of the grow. There are a lot of third-party tools that have emerged. You know, there's a lot of entrepreneurs in the space. A lot of third-party tools that have emerged that will plug in to these tracking systems, augment the existing tracking systems functionality, and give you more. So, for example, if you, you know, there are certain softwares and platforms out there that exist to help, you know, manage the, if you're doing an indoor grow, for example, manage the nutrient flow to the plant and manage the temperatures and humidities. Some of those softwares will plug in directly with these tracking systems and these business management systems to give you further functionality and further control over your results and your outputs. And then as you guys look into it, if Mexico regulations are going to allow export to countries like Europe, now you're going to start being really concerned with GMP and quality management systems. The European market requires they have certain certifications and be able to demonstrate that the product that you produced is, you know, follow GMP protocols, was produced in the correct environments, using the correct methods, those kinds of things. And for that, you really end up, you can end up doing it with spreadsheets and by hand, but that'll be a nightmare for it. To end up being able to execute that, you'll really end up needing to use a tracking system or a GMP system that will kind of a platform that will allow you to digitally represent your activities were up to snuff and performed in the correct manner, and be able to provide an audit log and proper reporting to those regulatory bodies. So there's a lot more that goes into it, just aside from just the supply chain management compliance aspect. The technology these days, every year, it's growing really rapidly and evolving rapidly. So you'll have more and more of these business enablement tools. But those are the kind of, just at a high level, the kinds of considerations you should start making, things you should start thinking about, start considering, or just getting more familiar with the notion that in this industry, you are going to need, to varying degrees, maybe a little less in Mexico than you would in another, less or more than versus Colombia or somewhere in the States. There might be a slight difference there, but you will need to implement a tool that allows you to track at a basic level your operations, track your supply chain, show that you've done everything compliantly. You'll need some tools that allow you to just regular business tools that you would take for granted in other industries, you know, whether it be for online ordering or marketing or just managing inventory and things like that. A lot of the regular softwares and tools that you've become accustomed to in other industries are simply not available in cannabis. They're not friendly to cannabis. So those are other elements that you'll need to consider and just need to be prepared for doing a little research or speaking with somebody like you know, your friends here at the Hoban Group or myself. I'm happy to help you kind of work through some of those nuances and set up your guys' best tech stack and digital strategy. So at a high level, I think those are the bullet points I wanted to cover. If I'm not mistaken, the last slide should just be a thank you and a Q&A type of slide, if you don't mind, Deanna. But yeah, so there's definitely much more to talk about. I wanted to be mindful of our time slot here and of the other speakers. So I know there is going to be a Q&A portion, I think in I don't know if immediately, but TC, you'll let us know, and in a little bit we'll have some more Q&As that I can answer any questions anybody might have.
Thank you so much, Raphael. You did a wonderful job of condensing such a very important component to helping ensure that we are compliant, we meet regulations. And as you mentioned, obviously it's going to be different country to country, but it's something that everyone needs to take in consideration, whether you're in the cultivation side, the farming, processing, or even for those of you that are interested in manufacturing and retail as well. So it's just important to keep that top of mind. I just want to reiterate that please feel free to write in your questions. At the end of our next speaker, we will host some time to address these questions with Raphael as well as Bob Hoban. And without further ado, Bob probably doesn't need much introduction, but for those of you that are interested in Bob's background, he's been in the cannabis industry for the last 12 years and has painstakingly grown his organization, the Hoban Law Group, and is the president and founder. He also sits at the center of the world's largest network throughout the globe based on his work that he's done with governments as well as innovators and other types of organizations, investors as well. So his global capacity to help cannabis businesses is extraordinary. And it would be remiss without saying he's a prolific author as well, and has recently become one of the reporters and is writing for Forbes as it relates to cannabis. So with that, I'm going to introduce Bob Hoban, who is going to address the international commerce and economics around cannabis. So Bob, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Cece, for the kind introduction. And looks as if I am taking control of the slides here. Let me just make sure I've got that in place. All right. Perfect. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks to CC and GPS for putting this on. Thanks to Ryan and so forth and so on. Just really a great panel. The Mexican market, the potential of the Mexican market is extraordinarily interesting to me and so many people that are watching, as we'll get into in just a moment. Some of the things that we talk about have to do with, you know, whether the Mexican market will in fact be one of the largest markets in the world. And we certainly think it has that capability because of just the slow progress in rolling different things out in Europe and across Latin America. Its policies, which we'll get into in a moment, are really well thought out. I've traveled there with our great friend Lorena Beltran, with Luis, who you'll hear from in a moment, and just communicated with so many people. The thought that's going into this is really impressive, because so many countries, when they do organize legislation or move it forward, they truly don't think it through. They don't try to learn lessons from other places. And I think because that is what's occurred thus far, that I believe that it's got great possibilities. So my point to you is that we're looking at it very closely, and you know, it begs the question: which model is best for and in Mexico? And I'll get into some of those details in just a moment. The model in Mexico, as it's being discussed, generally speaking, looks at marijuana, and I'll use the word marijuana instead of so many people use the word cannabis. That's awfully confusing, considering that cannabis is the plant, marijuana is one sector of the industry, hemp is the other sector of the industry. And the marijuana side of the industry is extraordinarily interesting as it moves into Mexico against the backdrop of a medical marijuana policy that was enacted years ago, but not really regulated and enforced thus far. So this will move that forward. It will create a distribution system within the country. It looks at an export scenario on the marijuana side. Now the hemp side, which is what we're focusing a lot on today, has far more upside than the marijuana industry. And that is not intuitive for most people that hear that for the first time. They'll think, well, a kilogram of marijuana is far more valuable than a kilogram of industrial hemp biomaterial. So how could that possibly be? Well, it's far less regulated, far less costly to produce, and it can service multiple industries. Therefore, it is a more sustainable crop. And we'll get into that here in just a moment. So starting at the beginning here, we are on the verge of recreational use and commercialized legalization in Mexico. In fact, if you go outside of the Mexican Senate right now, I've seen pictures of this for some time now. There is a marijuana garden, which is intended to demonstrate to policymakers, to professionals, just to your average Mexican citizen, that this plant is not something to be feared. And it can demonstrate that this plant is just that, a plant that can be commercialized and regulated. So the Supreme Court of Mexico has given lawmakers until December 15th to finalize legislation. We'll talk about some of the features as it currently sits based on my information, and ultimately those things may have changed in recent days since I prepared this PowerPoint slide. The deadline by the Supreme Court was, in fact, earlier this year. I was in Mexico in February with Luis and Lorena and several other folks, and the debate was very hot. And it was determined that certain things were moving forward. But because of the pandemic and various other reasons, that deadline was extended till December 15th. And Luis will update us further here in a little bit. But it seems to me that that deadline is, in fact, set in stone. So what are some of the features? Now, remember, medical marijuana was legalized in 2017, but rules have not been put in effect. So what does that mean? So many countries, so many regions enact legislation, but it signals a desire to move forward with a legislative change. Now, in other countries, Peru's a great example of this as well. In other countries where legislation moved forward and said, we would like to create this legislative change, the government simply did not create regulations to correspond with the new legislation. And I don't want to get too legalese here, but my focus is trying to describe to those listening that there is a difference between legislation and regulations. Sometimes regulations are known as secondary regulations, meaning the legislation is what changes the law. The legislation changes the law and says, this is what we're going to do. And then it delegates responsibility, typically in that law, to agencies to create those secondary regulations about how that law is going to be implemented. In the United States, when legislation happens, there's entrepreneurs the very next day out there selling that product on the street. It's not yet regulated, so they're therefore not completely legalized yet. But in other countries, because of the way governments move and law enforcement corresponds with that, commercial entrepreneurs are much more trepidatious to move forward without the regulations put in place. The law would make it legal to carry a certain amount of marijuana, therefore decriminalizing marijuana up to a certain point. It's my understanding that that certain amount of marijuana is being debated right now. At least my information doesn't have what that number is. It would not allow for lack of a better way to put it, Dutch-style cannabis cafes, but the sale of marijuana at private facilities will be allowed. So think of it this way. I've noted that it's kind of like the Uruguayan model, but Uruguay, of course, is a very small country. Uruguay came out and said it's legal it's always been legal since the 70s in Uruguay, for example, to possess a certain amount of cannabis, of marijuana. They don't allow dispensaries, they don't allow cafes at present. Now there is a club scenario, which is how people can get together and grow, but the sale of marijuana will be done and is being done in Uruguay through pharmacies. Now that might not be the best place to put the sale of marijuana. The Mexican legislature is determining what private outfits will distribute marijuana, but that's an extraordinarily compelling piece. The proposed laws establish rules that favor social equity, prevent monopolies, and provide for considerable tax revenues. Those three issues are critically important. And of course, I'm talking about the marijuana side of the industry here, or the marijuana side of the forthcoming Mexican legislation. Social equity. Most of you are familiar with the concept, but the idea of social equity, meaning that different disadvantaged groups or groups that could use, for lack of a better way put it, a leg up, an advancement because of the way that the criminalization of this plant and other drugs generally have affected them. It puts people in a more balanced position to pursue participation in the commercial field. Prevents monopolies. Now that is an objective. That's something that I've talked about with several policy advocates in Mexico for well over a year now. And that is, how do you prevent monopolies? And what does a monopoly mean? Let me put it this way. The Mexican legislature and Mexican policy officials want to make sure that what happened in other countries, let's use Colombia as an example, does not happen in Mexico. In other words, let's not allow major, for example, North American companies to come in and just dominate the space. So the prevention of monopolies has multiple facets to it. Where does the money come from? Who controls the actual day-to-day operations and the direction of the company? And the Colombian marketplace is, of course, coming back, but it really hasn't gotten off even to a strong footing because so much money was invested early on, particularly by the Canadian companies, to the tunes of hundreds, literally hundreds of millions of dollars. To date, and that was 3 and 4 years ago, to date, the Colombian marketplace has yet to export commercially viable quantities of products. There's been test products and press releases, in large part because the money was spent too quickly. The money was spent in a way that was not smart. It led itself to this concept of what falls under the guise of what is a monopoly. So that's an important consideration because there's careful thought put towards putting Mexican citizens and at least Mexican-derived capital in a driver's seat to lead these companies, and that's probably the way it should be, with a tighter understanding of the country's rich agricultural history, its politics, and the export and import marketplace. And then the tax revenue. That is one discussion that we had at length in February in Mexico City at the Senate, where we did talk with the Mexican Senate officials, and one senator in particular was extremely interested in the different tax models. So we described the taxation journey from the plant at all the different levels where the government has the ability or where the government has asserted itself in other jurisdictions to look at taxation. For example, a canopy tax, a tax on the number of plants that would be in a facility, an excise tax, tax on the amount of material that actually comes out of the facility. Then, of course, you've got retail taxes, taxes that are passed on to the consumer. You've got taxes that are paid by the operators, the licensees, taxes paid by the manufacturers. Now, I'm not suggesting there needs to be a tax in all of those places, but to describe what's happening around the world in various jurisdictions was extremely important. And I think that the Mexican approach to that topic, that discussion, is extraordinarily interesting because they have put a lot of thought, the officials have, the policymakers have, towards this forthcoming legislation. Now, my most recent information would suggest that the Senate is divided to allow the industrial cultivation of hemp, because there are existing industries that would be impacted. Now, we've talked about this. I'll go into it a little bit more at the risk of sort of beating a dead horse. I just want to describe to you what I truly believe is that industrial hemp is the backbone of the industry. Now, if somebody wants to go in and purchase a marijuana flower or a distillate derived from a marijuana flower that has high levels of THC and a combination of cannabinoids that it will have a psychoactive impact, in other words, produce a high of some sort, then it would be essential for that flower, that plant material, to have high levels of THC. But as a general rule, the marketplace is not evolving that way around the world. The marketplace is evolving based on formulations. Those formulations say that I can take as much THC I need out of 100 or 1,000 acres of industrial hemp, even at low amounts of THC per plant, and still participate in a psychoactive or medicinal-based industry. And we'll get into a little bit more of that later. But my point is, industrial hemp is the feature that allows people to participate in international commerce. Now, the thing that's most interesting is we're looking at the dispensation of marijuana within the country of Mexico to its citizens for adult use, for medicinal purposes, so forth and so on. That's an interesting feature that would require direct legalization and regulation of the marijuana plant. But most other uses, particularly export uses, do not rely on marijuana. And that's an important thing. We always talk about context, meaning what is the context in which you are situated? How can you make decisions to invest money, to pursue a license, to engage in a business operation without understanding everything that's going on around you? And folks across Latin America, around the world, make decisions completely lacking context. I know that's what GPS seeks to provide to its clients, but at the end of the day, It's that context that seems to be missing. If Mexico wants to create a viable domestic distribution system for marijuana, it seems well in its way to do so. That will be viable by all accounts. That will be profitable by all accounts. That will generate a great deal of revenue for those companies and in turn the government. But it's ignoring the export capabilities and the fact that there are very few export destinations for marijuana right now globally. There's just a handful that accept commercial quantities of THC products, and most of those products are being supplied presently by the Canadians at a higher price point because of their cost of high level of regulation and because you effectively have to grow everything indoors. Even though that might be the pharma standard for certain THC or marijuana uses. And the second market that exports a lot of cannabis from the Western Hemisphere to date would be the Uruguayan marketplace. And then, of course, Israel has been engaged in international commerce for some time now, producing high-level, particularly pharma-grade marijuana materials. So the differences of opinion on whether hemp should be included should come down in favor of hemp because it will protect farmers, so long as farmers don't fall for the CBD, the lure of CBD and just cannabinoids, because that lure is just that. It's not exactly the reality. Let me give you an example. A company like Charlotte's Web, and these numbers are generally accurate but not specific. Charlotte's Web, a global company that produces CBD products and distributes them all over the world, can handle and produce all of its own needed cannabinoids for all of its products for global distribution in less than 100 acres of its own production in the state of Colorado. Think about that for a moment. One of the leading global companies with distribution of CBD products can take care of all of its needs with less than 100 acres of industrial hemp that's rich in cannabinoids. Now, it's even less than that. As I understand it, it's less than 50 acres, although that may have changed. So my point to you is that growing industrial hemp simply for cannabinoid extraction is not a viable business plan. It misses context because suppliers are abundant. Now, what can differentiate a potential cannabinoid farmer and processor from other folks is having certifications, having standards, moving towards a more commoditized model of how that plant material is grown based on solid genetics and processed. But even then, you're looking at producing an enormous amount of cannabinoids where even though there is a great deal of consumer demand globally, there aren't many distribution outlets. And until that equals out, distribution and production and the regulations that close the gap between the two globally, uniform and globally, then we have challenges. So as we move forward, sort of running down some of the other features of the potential Mexican law, Mexico would become the biggest legal market in the world if this bill passes. And I think it has that kind of potential. The question would be culturally, does your average Mexican citizen, would they consider buying their marijuana for whatever purpose, medicinal or adult use, would they consider buying that at a store? Now, we've seen the gray market, as we'd call it, where the illicit market, which is a little bit more distinct from the gray market in the United States. And there are certain places across the country in the US where people simply don't go to the dispensaries. They'd still rather purchase it from the person that they've purchased that cannabis from for quite some time. So this is something to think about. We've also seen, it's not an apples to apples equal comparison, but in Uruguay, the majority of cannabis smokers, and there's a large number of cannabis smokers in Uruguay, they won't go to the pharmacies to purchase their cannabis. They'll grow it themselves. They'll create a club, quote unquote, which is merely a way to cultivate cannabis together and avoid the commercialized market. So there is a question that I have that we need to dive in more deeply as to whether culturally a storefront system will in fact be successful and viable in Mexico. it might not be the home run that folks are thinking it will be. Now, because of this forthcoming legislation, there are quote unquote big players in the legal marijuana industry, and they're very interested in both the medicinal and the recreational marijuana sectors. Numerous of these quote unquote big players are clients of our law firm, and they've had us closely examine this and watch this, meet people, make introductions, provide network opportunities, and to set the table for participation, although their participation might be limited to licensing, minority investment, and sharing of expertise and knowledge rather than control and majority ownership because of the anti-monopoly provisions set forth in this potential forthcoming legislation. And then ultimately, this is an interesting feature because across the United States, most states by far that have some form of regulated commercial cannabis also allow individual citizens' rights to cultivate their own material. For example, in Colorado here in the USA, individuals are allowed to cultivate a certain number of plants on their own for their own personal use, and also on under a medical system, caregivers, which is a legally defined term as someone who does care for a patient with one of the medical marijuana qualifying conditions. Those people can cultivate cannabis too. That has created the quote unquote gray market that I talked about earlier. It creates competition for the commercial regulated market, which already has competition on the other end of the spectrum, which is the illicit or the black market, sometimes known as the traditional market. So these are some things to think about, but the fact that the potential Mexican legislation would not allow individuals to cultivate marijuana for personal use is not dissimilar to what we've seen in other countries. For example, even Germany doesn't allow for that, and they have a robust commercial program and an individual rights program, and accordingly, they don't even allow domestic cultivation to date, although that's changing. So they import their material so they can avoid this distinction between commercial regulated marijuana, gray market marijuana, and black market or illicit market marijuana. These are real considerations that make operating a regulated commercial industry very difficult. One more example about why that's difficult. Think about the California marketplace. The California marketplace is a great example about what I talked about earlier, in that culturally, most Californians would choose not to purchase their cannabis from a regulated dispensary. Instead, they would rather go to their traditional hookup, for lack of a better way to put it. And because of California's rich history in providing and cultivating high quality cannabis and illicitly distributing that across the United States and beyond, the notion there is that we have a challenge, because that illicit market competes with pricing on the regulated commercial side. It competes with the number of individuals who would go in and purchase material, and it really puts a stumbling block in the way of commercial regulated dispensaries. And if the government expects to see a certain amount of revenue, therefore a certain amount of tax revenue to it, the illicit or the gray market can undercut that dramatically. So something to think about from a practical perspective. Now, hemp in Mexico, and that's where I'll focus the remainder of my discussion, because I think that hemp is something that a lot of people don't understand. And at the risk of repeating some of the great information we've had from Raphael and Ryan and Eric, I want to just go into why hemp is truly something that needs to move forward and really creates this backdrop for global commerce. Prior to the Supreme Court mandate, COFEPRIS, the Mexican FDA, for lack of a better way to describe it, did allow the registration and importation of CBD products. One of our clients out of Texas was Green Lotus Cannabis, was one of the first registrants with COFEPRIS, and ultimately imported material, continues to do so to this day. A number of others followed suit, registering, showing safety data associated with their product, and distributing products from the United States into Mexico. Now, COFEPRIS had ceased receiving those registrations, or at least acting on them, in late 2019 because of the forthcoming legislation, based on my understanding. So The Mexican hemp market, based on data, is predicted to be worth around $2 billion. That's 2 billion with a B. And a lot of that would service multiple verticals. One plant that protects farmers because you're not just growing one thing and using the plant for one single purpose. You're using a plant to service multiple industries, which diversifies the offering and protects farmers. If farmers, and this happened in the US and it's happening in Europe right now, if farmers grow a single purpose CBD crop, 100 other farmers plus are going to do the exact same thing. With no infrastructure, no regulated distribution outlets, no brick and mortar stores, and no ability to really export that material on the cannabinoid side because the market is saturated globally, that fails the farmers. And that's what I want you to take away. If you're an investor or an entrepreneur, we have to protect the farmers because the farmers are our business partners in this endeavor. And if the farmers grow a bunch of material that can't be sold, and gets left in a field, we see this in the United States. We had hundreds of thousands of acres grown in 2019. The vast majority of that material sits in warehouses or in the field to this day because there's no use for it and no distribution market for it. But I do believe it is the industrial uses, as I mentioned, that helps the farmers the most. Now, I won't beat this dead horse, but I want you to understand my perspective here. And that doesn't mean that this is exactly what's going to happen. But the industrial hemp plant is and will continue to be the backbone of the global cannabis supply chain. Yes, the entire cannabis supply chain, not limited to food, fuel, fiber, and industrial uses, but wellness and medicines too. And we saw the European Union have some movement this week where they agreed to increase the 0.2 THC percentage level for hemp, which has been sort of a indirect way of saying hemp material must be below 0.2, having to do with genetics more so than the plant material and the finished goods, that they've agreed to move forward looking at 0.3% as the level. That will uncover certain certified varieties that are held in seed banks across the European Union and beyond that have 0.3% that were not otherwise authorized to enter into international commerce or European commerce because they exceeded the 0.2% THC limit. But looking at that alone, look at what this plant can do. Look at what this plant can do. And again, you can see all of these different verticals. I'm not here as a zealot to tell you that hemp is going to do all of these things tomorrow. But what I am saying is we knew as early as the 1930s, and if not earlier, that the industrial hemp plant can service all of these distinct industries. We're focused primarily right now on the medical side of things or the nutritional supplement side of things. The food side of things is coming around. The fabric side of things, of course, requires more infrastructure and decortication. Look at livestock, food, and bedding. I'd consider that the low-hanging fruit. The European Union has used those materials for that purpose for quite some time. As we look at plastics, of course, are derived from the industrial hemp plant. The most efficient way to do that is to pelletize after milling hemp material that comes into a particular warehouse and then gets milled and pelletized. Pelletizing the plant, just like the little pellets you might see in a pellet stove for heat. It preserves the oils, it preserves the internal compounds of the plant in a way that could be stored for longer than just biomass, particularly biomass that's wrapped up in that plastic marshmallow setting. Moving forward, the investment world is looking at all point solutions of the cannabis plant, elements of the ecosystem. We talked about this. Grain. You could be a hemp farmer right now and grow grain because of the pricing and the demand globally with protein deficiencies and the interruption of the supply chain by COVID. You could make more money as a farmer growing hemp for grain right now on a limited basis than growing any other crop, with certain exceptions, of course. But that is something that people miss. Fiber requires infrastructure. The kief, you can capture the kief, the cannabinoids, the terpenes, concentrate that, and then send that to an extraction or refinement facility. And then, as I mentioned, even THC comes out of the industrial hemp plant. And people don't know this, but when we passed the 2018 Farm Bill in the US, the THC was removed removed from the Controlled Substances Act as it relates to being derived from industrial hemp. That doesn't mean that people should be taking it out and removing it and selling it out of their garages, which is happening, unfortunately. But it does mean that it's a signal that when you have 10 to 12 metric tons of biomass per acre, and you have 100, let alone 1,000 acres, that is a significant amount of THC at 0.3%, let alone 1%, which is some of the discussion surrounding industrial hemp. But you have to know where you fit. I believe that Latin America is the greatest opportunity right now. There is a huge demand in Europe, but the number of distribution outlets, brick and mortar stores, has decreased from well over 15,000 a year and a half ago to under 3,000 to date, because of lawsuits that were threatened and because of the lack of regulation over the plant material. We see nationalized healthcare systems adopting the use of industrial hemp and or cannabinoids from the cannabis plant in Brazil. Argentina's certain to come out with something before the end of the year. Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, so forth and so on down the line, including Costa Rica. These are countries that are producing the material for wellness purposes, to be distributed and sponsored by nationalized healthcare systems, to be put into stores as a simple wellness product, and to be exported. Now that is a distinction. We've seen the Latin American market initially develop with export-only models. Think Colombia, think Uruguay for certain purposes. But the balance between having a domestic model, domestic distribution, and a export model is essential if anyone wants to create this as an economic driver. So I would suggest very strongly, and I know Eric talked about this, that the new paradigm is the whole plant use. Look at, if you plant a plant that's certified, the multi-purpose plant that contains anywhere from 3 to 8% CBD, but also cultivates for grain, also produces straw, also produces herd. This is the supply chain mentality. This is the commodity mentality, that if a farmer grows their plants and makes their economic projections based on grain and fiber, then cannabinoids. Treat the cannabinoids as your waste product. It might make you rich one day. The next 10 days, you're not going to be able to sell 1 milligram of it because the market's so saturated. But don't put your eggs in that particular basket. So that is the new paradigm. I'll talk a little bit about technology here for a moment. We've seen the need for harvesters. We've seen drone technology, which can sex the plants from above. It can provide wet and dry nutrients. It can plant seeds. It can, in real time, precisely define what parts of your field need additional attention from a water or nutrients perspective. So drone technology is driving the industrial hemp industry in a major way. Harvesters, harvesting technology. We've seen lettuce pickers. We've seen hand harvest. We've seen a number of combines. It depends what you're planning it for, but I would suggest very strongly that you'd look at something that similar to what we see in that picture, which is a German product, the multi-combine HC, which is produced and designed by Raphael Dulan and the Hanf farm, H-A-N-F farm in Germany. They are buildable, developable, and exportable, although you can find something in between to fit your genetics. And genetics are critical. Start, as Eric points out, by doing a test plot. Don't plant hundreds of acres because you will not have a place to sell it, let alone any data to determine how much and how much better yield you could get unless you do the testing. Make sure you register your genetics with the appropriate government officials and government agencies and obtain as many certifications as possible. And when you think about cross-border transactions, think about the idea of customs. What is the customs process for import or export? What are phytosanitary requirements for plant or seed material? Understand those. Who do you go to? What's your timeline? You will get tripped up on the export or import process on all of these things unless you think about them in advance. And that is something you can attempt to do on your own. Certainly legal counsel can help, but I know GPS has done this quite often. Look at your strategies, international expansion strategies, investment strategies. What's the investment strategy? Invest in where the puck is going. And I know that hockey's probably not extremely popular in Mexico, but it's this idea that if you're a hockey player, you don't go to where the puck is, because by the time you get there, the puck is somewhere else. Anticipate where the puck is going, and it's not extraction infrastructure. It's more broad-based agricultural infrastructure, not just in new markets, but also globally. Think about how that affects your M&A, your mergers and acquisitions, or your capital raise strategies. Think about what's happening in Europe and follow this. Context is extraordinarily important. FDA in the United States will, unfortunately, or fortunately, we shall see, set the standard for how hemp will be treated globally. We're seeing what's happening at the United Nations. I just wrote an article in Forbes about that. Take a look at that United Nations article, how the United States disagreed with some of the changes that are recommended, which would free the cannabinoids from the cannabis plant from international regulation, or at least international scheduling at the highest of levels. And then the European Union. What's happening with what was otherwise previously deemed as a novel foods concept? In other words, a new food ingredient, which is moving towards narcotic-based treatment. And then, of course, you've got the UK, upon its exit from the European Union, moving forward with a novel foods type scenario. So it is truly regulatory chaos. Please understand what your context is and what your potential distribution looks like before you engage too deeply, because at the end of the day, context does matter unless you have an opportunity to domestically distribute, which will take years, if not more, to evolve. So that is the bulk of it. I know I covered an extraordinary amount of material in a very, very, very short period of time. I just wanted to give you a very broad overview. But we're very excited about the Mexican market at the Hoban Law Group. Luis will talk in just a moment. We're looking at office space in Mexico City as we speak, intending to visit and have several meetings there the third week of the month, adding to our already strong Mexican-based team of lawyers and consultants, and aligning with the right professionals across the region so that we can bring knowledge and expertise and be able to service folks seeking to expand in that market, but also drawing upon the rich experience of professionals in that marketplace so that we can not just say, here's how it's done everywhere else, but we can temper that with Mexican culture, Mexican philosophy, and some sort of agronomic history, because that's critical if this industry is going to survive. Thank you, Cece.
Thank you, Bob. And wow, a wealth of information and a ton of opportunity. So at this stage, I'd like to invite all of our panelists to join us, as many of the questions are for the wide variety of our panelists. So if you could all come back in, I'd like to field some of these questions to you. So Rafael, Ryan, Eric. So Rafael, this came in from Alberto as well. Which point of the traceability chain would you say most people fail to comply with?
Well, there's going to be, to answer that question, there's going to be a couple of points that are, I guess, vulnerability points, if you will, right? And it's going to be whenever inventory is either changing hands, so transport events, so whether it's going from a cultivation over to manufacturing, or I don't know if it's going to be a relevant example, but if it's going from manufacturing to retail in Mexico, or if it's going from export, whenever it's changing hands between organizations, that's usually going to be an opportunity for mistakes to happen or details to get missed. But other than that, some of the more nuanced practices, so specifically when it gets into manufacturing, once you start looking at, extracting cannabinoids and some of the more nuanced manufacturing processes, depending on the regulations that are in place in the state, that may sometimes lend itself into, inadvertent mistakes or just the more nuanced, detailed workflows just require more attention, more control. The softwares that are in place for that will usually cover a lot of that, so we make sure that you're following the workflows necessary. But just like anything else in the world, a human can always decide to do something that the software tells them not to. So those are usually going to be the opportunities when things are changing hand or when you're in more of a detailed practice.
Thank you, Raphael. Ryan, this one is directed towards you, and the question from Andreas Perez is it viable to grow both hemp and cannabis in the same site?
So we'd want to specify, we're talking about cannabis for flower production, I assume.
It was not specified. Let's just assume that.
Let's see. So we wouldn't be talking about a greenhouse because fiber production, like I mentioned in my presentation, it's really too tall to stick in a greenhouse. So we're talking about an outdoor crop. If the industrial hemp that's grown for fiber is feminized, or at least can be screened for only female plants, then I don't see a problem with that. The biggest risk is that you've got fiber plants that are both male and female and could unintentionally pollinate the crop that's being grown for flower. So that would be the biggest risk. Otherwise, I don't see a problem growing those on the same farm.
Okay, great. Bob, this one is directed towards you. It's nutritional supplements are considered medical use, and will that be regulated like everything else? Maybe you could just comment on supplements versus pharmaceutical as it relates to medical use.
Sure, and I would temper this by saying, but by no means am I an expert of the COFEPRIS regulations, but it's my understanding that the system is somewhat similar to what we have in the United States with the FDA, where there is a level of food, there is a level of supplement regulation, and there is a level of pharmaceutical formulaic regulation. So ultimately, the previous registrations that we've enacted for some of our clients in Mexico required us to demonstrate safety data, consistency, and certifications at the facility for production standards. And those materials came in on the same level as a supplement. If something were to be a pharma grade material, of course, that requires much, much more oversight and regulation, meaning it has to be a specific formula, listen, for a specific condition. You're not going to see a pharma grade product that is not formulated unless it's intended to treat a specific condition. So that is the distinction between a pharma grade material in addition to some of the processing and the certifications required. But that also would require substantial resources because you have to go through a clinical trial and other processes to get that approved. Whereas a supplement, you merely need to show safety data, certifications that the material is safe for consumers. And then there is an element of saying that this can help support certain functions in the body, but does not address a specific condition. And then, of course, the food level, which doesn't just apply to grain. It applies to oil extracted from the grain or pressed from the grain, but it also can increasingly apply to cannabinoid-rich additives for food products below a certain level that also just need to show that it's safe and consumer-friendly.
Thank you, Bob. Alberto also asked, what has been the most innovative hemp product that we have seen? And I'm going to answer that question because it's actually a bicycle that's hanging in Bob Hoban's office that was actually used during an event called Burning Man here in the United States, in the desert of Arizona, where the heat is typically above 100 degrees for 24 hours of the day. And the bike survived. It's the components that couldn't take the heat. But I just thought it interesting that hemp really has a wide variety of uses. And I think there will be more innovative ways to find hemp, the more research money and individuals that are doing the research can bring to market.
And Cece, if I may, just for two seconds.
Sure.
That bike was made from hemp. In other words, hemp stalk made the frame. But here's the other interesting component of it. It was an electric bike, okay? It had a battery on it. It was powered. And the graphene capacitor, in other words, what allowed the battery to take a charge or discharge that power into the bike to propel it, was made from hemp graphene, So I would agree with you that that bike is pretty innovative, but it contains, perhaps in my mind, one of the most innovative ways to use the industrial hemp plant, and that is hemp graphene, which is costly. But if you look up hemp graphene and understand that hemp contains properties that lend itself very well to being a supercapacitor. In other words, something that could take on a charge very quickly and discharge that power over time. There are properties there, and to me, that's one of the most innovative and forthcoming ways to use this plant.
Thank you, Bob. And before I turn this over to our last speaker, I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors once again. RD Cultivation, again, please feel free to reach out to Ryan if you have any cultivation questions. Eric Singular, as part of Gateway Proven Strategies, the cannabis consulting firm that is here to help in every aspect of the supply chain, whether you're looking to create a business and or operationalize it. Gateway Proven Strategies has services to meet your needs. Rafael Sabag from Akerna, thank you very much for helping us understand the tools needed for the supportive aspect of the business. For anyone that's looking into compliance, track and trace, or any technology, please feel free to reach out to Rafael. And also Bob Hoban and the Hoban Law Group. As we heard, he is making a move to situate himself in Mexico City with the impending changes that are happening. And with that, I also just want to take a quick moment and thank the staff at GPS for hosting the technology and all of the background and back office needs of this webinar. So the one person that I also want to take great thanks is Luis Armendariz from CAM Legal, who is also works with the Hoban Law Group. Without you, it would not have been possible. So we thank you profusely and hope that this educates everyone in a way that actually asks more questions. So with that, Luis, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Hi, Cece. Thank you so much for your kind words. And it's an honor to be with such an all-star lineup here, just rock stars. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with just so many interested Mexican people and companies in just learning about the potential of the hemp industry in Mexico and just the technical part, which is, since we started this long process, this long journey, which is not over yet, obviously, and hopefully by December 15th, we'll have that mission accomplished of at least some legislative action by the Senate. People and companies inquire often about how do we start. There is so much potential in Mexico in terms of the surface, the land that we have to cultivate. There is so much the tradition, the agricultural tradition and potential that Mexican companies and groups and states and local communities have to grow, from, if you start up north, livestock, cattle grazing, dairy products, Sinaloa, you look at tomato, wheat and corn throughout the country. And, so much potential, apples here in Chihuahua. We have so much agricultural potential. We have economic power, really regional groups that are looking and considering at this hemp potential. And so it's really useful to have all this technical information, not necessarily legal, although it's mostly intertwined. But just know about how they can get started, because that's something that us as legal consultants get asked, the most frequently asked questions. How do we start the technical part, the surface, the seeds? And so I'll try to go real quick about just what can we expect in terms of the pending bill that is already approved by the Senate committees back in March, which is a really significant legislative step. If it wasn't for the COVID pandemic, we would probably had already this bill submitted to general vote in the Senate. And the new deadline, like I said, is December 15th. And what are we going to see? And I don't want to be redundant of the preview that Bob gave, but this is going to be a full, as the Americans, or as we say in English, the whole enchilada legalization. We're going to have recreational, medical, already legal for about 3 years now, just pending secondary rules issuance. But the wellness products, CBD, and then obviously industrial hemp. What can we expect once this bill is passed? This bill is supposed to, and just touching very briefly on the guiding principles for this big step, this big pivot in policy change. Public health, social justice or social equity, sustainable development, meeting the 2030 sustainability agenda, the commitments that Mexico as a country has, and obviously abide by the Supreme Court mandate of respecting this human right to develop one's personality, meaning just the protection and the acknowledgement of recreational use for individuals. So the main difference, turning a little bit our focus over to hemp, the distinguished threshold is going to be 1% THC, and the proposed law will refer to them mostly as psychoactive and non-psychoactive cannabis. So it has a few mentions about the term hemp or cáñamo, and that's how we see it throughout this bill. We see definitions of THC and CBD. We don't have definitions of other cannabinoids. So this is going to focus mainly maybe down the road in a few years or months, we're going to see some challenges in regulating other cannabinoids besides CBD and THC. But so far we have that. And this bill will have a structure of licenses, as you may know. There's 5 types. One of them is cultivation, a cultivation license. The other 4 are sale, import, export, processing, and research. Here, vertical integration will not be allowed. So if you're planning a cultivation project, which is the main focus of this exercise, this activity, cultivation, if you have that license, you will not be able to have another license, meaning processing or selling, unless you are a community that can prove and that are somehow certified as a group of people that are deemed vulnerable because of the prohibition and that have been harmed because of this prohibition policy. So what does this mean to groups, to entrepreneurs or companies that are contemplating these projects? That there may be some consideration necessary to potential joint ventures or partnerships with either local communities that can have the land, the knowledge, the workforce to develop a cultivation project. And then maybe you can explore other types of licenses so that you can do a nice synergy in terms of capital, workforce, knowledge, and license holding, of course. So the surface area, there's so many details about the bill, but focusing on cultivation, there's going to be a limit on cultivation for the land. And there's only one limit expressly set in this bill, which is for psychoactive cannabis, and this is 1 hectare for outdoor growing and 1,000 square meters if you're thinking about indoor or greenhouse. If you are planning to cultivate non-psychoactive, then there's no amount or a set surface that will be a limit. It just refers to it will be determined by the National Agricultural Policy. So we'll have to wait for that to come out. Now, as a parenthesis, and I'll touch on that later, one of the main takeaways from this brief conversation or summaries, I think that we can have an idea or a notion of what the general guidelines will be for hemp cultivation, sale, or processing, or import, export even. But as Bob mentions very accurately, we have this federal law that will still be subject to the secondary rules, which can be regulations by the government agency, guidelines, official norms that are more technical and compliant with the international technical standards. And that's, I mean, the perfect example at this point is the secondary rules that we're waiting for the medical use that has been legal technically since 2017. So a big number of the questions that one may have about this, if you get into, to the extent that you get into more detail, is that we're going to have to wait for secondary rules and for the guidelines and policy that the newly created government agency issues. The Mexican Cannabis Institute, or Instituto Mexicano del Cannabis, they will have so many attributions and legal authority and responsibility to issue guidelines in terms of testing and traceability mechanisms, designating accredited labs, even issuing certificates of sustainable development, helping and collaborating with financing from development banking institutions, determining the number of licenses that a person can hold, what would be the allowed or permissible ratio between THC and CBD. So if you look at the bill, you're going to see a few pages just with a long list of things, guidelines, rules that this Mexican Cannabis Institute will have to issue. So this institute is supposed to be working and in place at least a year after the law is enacted. So the latest version of the bill that we have was dated in February before the March approval by the Senate committees, and it provided for at least 1 year for this institute to be in place. So there's, you know, everything that entails: the budget allocation, just the internal rules, so that this institute, this agency, will know how to work, and we'll have to wait for that. In the meantime, I know we're running a little out of time, but in the meantime, what can we expect is this bill has some transitory provisions, which means this is what's going to happen while, you know, in the following months or years after the bill is approved, and you know, all these pieces of the puzzle are in place. While the institute is created and working, there's going to be a special committee that is going to be led by the Secretary of the Interior, and they are going to have the authority to resolve, to issue the licenses, the applications that would correspond to this institute. There's a process in place so that the seeds can be registered and transitioned into the legitimate legal status. And there's also a timeline to issue the licenses. Cultivation licenses can be issued as soon as traceability or testing rules are in place. And for the processing of and sale of non-psychoactive cannabis, 6 months. 6 months after the bill is approved, except for edibles, beverages, and cosmetics, which will have to wait 18 months after the bill is approved. So right now, that's, you know, a timeline that we can consider, so that anybody considering an investment or a plan to enter either one of these verticals can take into account. There are, and it's important to know, aside from these secondary rules, there are other sets of rules that will apply, and we can answer questions and elaborate later, obviously. But you have laws and regulations that apply to the actual seed production, certification, and commerce. There is a government agency, an organization called the National Service for Seed Inspection and Qualification, or SNICS, as the Mexican acronym, or Spanish. There's a National Service for Agro, Food, Sanitation, Inequity, and Quality, the SENASICA, which prevents or seeks to reduce the contamination of the primary production stage in accordance with the Mexican law of vegetal sanitation. And Agricultural Ministry, the Secretary of Agriculture, the SADER, which have in turn secondary rules, sets of laws that have to apply depending on the business that you're, or the project that you're wanting to implement. So that's more or less in a very short nutshell what we can expect. We have a lot of inquiries from these big groups that are wanting to take the first steps, see what the compliance requirements are going to be, become familiar with the traceability and testing guidelines with what we have, considering what we have already in this bill, pending all this further detail and secondary rules. Just, surface rights, there's an ingredient of, depending on the region, your local community relations. If you're planning to cultivate, there are social factors that you have to consider. One of the questions I saw is that the narcos and how to deal with them. It's, such a complex question, but we have it and we're faced with it. It really depends on the region, and not only for the narcos, but these local communities, ejidos, this special type of agrarian land ownership regime, which is, amounts for more than half of the Mexican surface land. So, you can start putting all these pieces in place, make sure that you get the advice from professionals that can help on the technical part, just as the speakers, the participants that we've heard before me. So, we're open and available for questions, follow-up. And before I turn it over to Cece so that she can close, also I want to echo the gratitude to our sponsors and the effort, particularly by the For 2020 movement. The legalization movement is an effort that is led by Lorena Beltran as well, and a few other people. And that organization groups more than 100 or maybe 120 associations, individuals, companies, not only Mexican, but also foreign, that are all in the same page in trying to, join forces and raise the voice in making our politicians or government officials aware of the need to legalize and the need to distinguish hemp from cannabis, from marijuana, and avoid a big mistake that could be over-regulating hemp as an agro-industry, just like any others, as opposed to just the strict regulations that marijuana and psychoactive cannabis can have. So that's about it from me. And thanks again, Cece.
Luis, it was a pleasure. To all of our participants, thanks for your time, and please feel free to reach out to us. We will be calibrating all of the questions that we did answer and did not answer, and get those back out to you via email. And with that, this concludes our webinar. Take care, everyone.